All right, so let's kick our second discussion off. Before we get started, I want to remind you that if you did not have a chance to submit your responses to the MAC survey, please make sure you do so by the end of today. I looked and it looks like there was about half of the students who have done it. So if you've not done it yet, uh, please do. Again, just for the graduate students, for the undergraduate students, you don't have to worry about it. You can just you can use that extra time to think about how you would commit a fraud if you had a chance to. So. Um, Obviously teasing. So don't commit fraud. It's a bad idea. So today, there's a big reason why I structured this particular topic for this today, because we're going to be doing our investigation, or sorry, our interviewing, or as you might call it, interrogation on Thursday. So the questions need to be structured in a certain way, and this is kind of our guide for doing that. So as you're developing your topic list and as you're developing the list of people, your group also needs to be thinking about how are we going to approach the questions, because you can't just immediately storm in with saying, "Did you do it? Are you guilty?" That's not going to be a productive approach. So the method of interrogation is really, really important, and the question ordering sequence is critical. And this is kind of the goal, is to identify what it is that you need to consider as part of the investigation and how you need to think about this. Now, obviously, this is going to be an imperfect approach because we're asking another group to role play as individuals that they are not. Okay. To my knowledge, the groups 1 and 2 have not actually committed a fraud. Okay. Yeah, and I'm gonna try to stay with that. I'm gonna assume that everybody did not committed a fraud. If you have, don't tell me. But they've not committed a fraud, so they're trying to portray what their best impression is. That being said, that whole goal here is to figure out how do we get from point A to point whatever the end point is. It's a very sequential, it's an iterative process, and it's important to understand these things. So let's go ahead and get into some details here, and hopefully you found this, even if it's not necessarily straightforward, you found it useful as far as what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the week. So we had 2 resources, and there's basically a list of techniques that an interviewer should master to be a successful forensic interviewer. Now, this is kind of a standalone list, but I do think it's valuable to think about this list as what it is that we need to discover. So we talk about how we master the art of forensic interviews. Some of these are going to be pretty obvious, and some of these are going to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more distinct. So let's just go ahead before I start putting up the answers up here. I'm going to call in one of the groups. So I guess my first group leader is going to be Isaac. Isaac, what items did you identify on question 1?
Had be prepared, don't go out alone, build rapid rapport and trust, establish a baseline, analyze verbal and nonverbal indicators, let the interview do the talking, and be aware of employee rights.
Very good. Okay. Very good. So some of these are pretty obvious when we look at them, and there's not going to be too much that we need to drill down into, but let's go ahead and talk about these very briefly and make sure that we understand what is being conveyed here. So be prepared is a pretty apparent one. You do not want to go in an interview with no idea of what you're going to be doing. And that's why I'm telling you, have these lists developed, talk them out amongst your groups, think about how you're going to approach this, and most of all, send them initially to the groups that you're going to be interviewing, so they have a chance to prepare their answers. So there's preparation on both sides. Uh, you may not necessarily want to have that approach in the real world, but there needs to be at least some guidance about what topics are going to be discussed during the conversation. And so you need to be able to think about this initially. So the next one is one of those ones that we were talking about before we started back from the break, is that we don't want to go at it alone. You want to have a team that's going to be doing this. And this is unfortunate for my one student that's online, is that the one student's going to have to go at it alone, which they're going to be at a disadvantage. And for your projects at the end of semester, you are going to be doing this alone, which is going to be a challenging one. So this is something that you're going to have to develop a capacity for, is that you do need to be involved in both the interrogation and the analysis. So I would encourage, as the group started working together and start talking, that it's not just going to be one person asking all the questions, but everybody else should be asking. And the whole point of this is discussed in this particular paragraph, but I do want to kind of do it at a summary level. When you're asking questions and getting feedback, if you're taking notes, then you're missing nonverbal cues or items that might be really, really important for the discussion. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those shortly, about what some of those nonverbal cues might be. But if the rest of the group is watching, and if you've got one person dedicated to taking notes, one person dedicated to taking or answering or asking questions, and other people who are just observing, then you get 100% of the picture. And then during the debrief, it's very, very easy to figure out what's happening. Building rapport and trust from the beginning. I can't stress how important this is. given that the people that you're coming in, you know that they're basically you're playing the role as auditors. They haven't been made aware in this case that you're going to be forensics experts. Sometimes they might know it, but if they come in defensive, it is very, very difficult to untangle that knot if they come in defensive. So building rapport is basically saying we're going to have a conversation. It's just talking. We're trying to get to know one another, and extending trust is going to be really, really important because if they don't trust you, then they're not going to convey the details they need to know. This is also really important because if you know that somebody is trustworthy, then they're going to be responsive in a different way than if somebody is trying to hide what their responses are. So if you can develop trust with an individual, you can have a lot more clarity on what their responses are and whether you can rely upon those. So trying to develop that rapport and trust in the beginning, trying to make sure that people are not being defensive, really, really critical. Also, with respect to that, we need to establish a baseline. Has anybody ever watched a movie or a TV show where they use lie detectors? Okay, you watched at least some of those. I'm not saying every single day, but some of you may get into crime dramas, which no judgment there. But if you ever seen a TV show where they use lie detectors, their first thing to talk about is they ask questions that have factual responses. What is your name? How long have you been working for this organization? The whole point is that they want to determine on the lie detector when they answer a question that's factual, what is the deviation when something is not factual? How can they tell if there's a difference? Because if you see the line going like this on a factual question, basically the way lie detectors work is that people react differently when they're responding with falsehoods. Basically, their blood pressure changes, their heartbeat changes. A lot of different factors go into it, and so the dials on the, I don't know how you call them, the monitor on the lie detector will act differently if they're asking a question that they're knowingly telling a falsehood for. Now, that's kind of the same thing we're doing here is we're trying to determine if somebody's being factual, if somebody's telling an actual detail that's truthful, how is that different from when they're telling something that's more subjective? And subjectivity can lead to false positives. If you ask a question like, "What do you feel about this?" then they may respond with nervousness that's not necessarily going to indicate falsehood or that they're committing fraud, but something that just might indicate suspicion. So one of the things we're going to talk about with question answering is that we want to rely a lot on closed-ended questions when possible. It's not always possible, but when we can rely on closed-ended questions, we want to so that we can determine the difference between truth and falsehood. Both verbal and nonverbal indicators. We talked about this a little bit already. This is one of those ones that's really important to understand. Is anybody familiar with poker? Okay. So I'm not going to ask you to play poker. I played way too much poker when I was your age, and that's why it took me so long to get through school. Yeah. But one of the things they talk about for good poker players is recognizing tells. And if you, depending on the movie you watch, like there's a great movie with Matt Damon called Rounders, which talks about how you can actually tell what people are holding just by looking at the face. It's not actually that distinct. Okay. True poker players will say they can't actually do that, but they can tell when people are hiding information or when something has changed. Like there was a really, really good episode of this poker TV show. It's like 2 decades ago, but it was a celebrity poker show. And one of the comedians was on there was always talking. And then they got a good hand and they shut up immediately. And the guy who was broadcasting says, that's an obvious tell. So that was a nonverbal indicator or kind of a verbal to nonverbal indicator of a strength in that hand. Same holds true for fraud. If people act differently than their normal activity is, you can kind of derive something from that. Another indicator is when you're talking to somebody and they're kind of relaxed and they're putting their hands down here and then you ask a question and they do that. What happens when people go like this? What is that considered to be? This is a defensive posture, okay? This is trying to just put distance between yourself and the interviewer. So when you see body language and somebody like if somebody leans back and they answer a question, if somebody looks to the side, if their eyes roll up, they may be trying to think of a response because they don't have an answer that they want to share. It's like, okay, can you explain to me how the transaction should work in this area? It says, uh-oh, if I tell them exactly how it works, they're going to realize that I'm committing fraud here. So I need to think of something else to say. So the eyes shift around, they look around, they lean back, they sigh, they kind of scratch their head, they try to pause so they can come up with some sort of piece of detail. Now, am I trying to make you interrogation experts? No, but I do expect you to be able to determine the difference between when somebody's making up information and when they're telling you factual details. So that's an easy one to pick up on. Now, again, it's going to be a little bit more challenging during our interrogations because sometimes you may have somebody who says, okay, let me think about this. And they're thinking about the information from the case and not necessarily trying to lie to you. But you should still be able to pick up on that and still be able to determine if something is different, if the question had a different response than previous responses. Was that the case? Were they just trying to remember information, or were they trying to disguise something and try to hide it from your scrutiny? So interesting identifications there. Letting the interviewee do the talking. The more information that your interviewee volunteers, the more detail you can get. If you have to try to pry it out of them, then you're going to get less relevant detail. Also, there's the possibility that if you let the interviewer doing the talking, they may unwittingly tell you something that's going to be a critical detail. Whether they're guilty of a particular fraud or not, they can provide you with information that they would have not otherwise told you about. Probably the most important thing is be aware of employee rights. Keep in mind that you are subject to whatever legal and jurisdictional requirements are within an area. So you can't request them that they tell you information or admit to something that's illegal. So you do need to be aware of that. This is going to be less relevant in our situation because we're not dealing with a situation where there's going to be a circumstance where there's going to be an actual litigation. Like at the end of this activity, I'm not sending groups 1 and 2 to jail. Okay, that's not the plan. Okay, but in the real world, we do have to understand what the legal and regulatory boundaries are of our activities in that area. So important to note, and we're going to come back to this to some degree, but I do want to move on so that we have plenty of time. So a second resource, what are the stages of the peace method of interrogation, and briefly describe what is involved in each stage. So Austin, I think your group's up for this. So what are the stages of the peace interrogation method?
Verification, challenge, closure, knowledge.
Okay. So planning and preparation. Now, obviously, this is pretty straightforward as to what this means. When we talk about planning and preparation, you can't walk in cold. You have to have an idea of what it is you're going to be doing. Now, one of the reasons I changed the nature of the investigation on Thursday from saying give them a list of questions to give them a list of topics is because your questions may change based on the response from the individuals that you're interrogating. So you need to have an idea, but you also need to be adaptive. All right. Engage and explain. The people who are asking questions if they don't understand the context for the question, they may give you information that's not relevant or inaccurate. So we want to make sure that they are very, very clear. Account clarification and challenge. If there's questions on the part of the interviewee, then you need to be very, very open to tell them what it's going to be that they need to understand. And so the clarification and the challenging the information to get additional detail, really important. Closure, we'll talk more about closure when we get to a few more steps later on, but obviously we want to get to the end result that we're happy with to at least move forward, or in the case of an admission seeking question, that we want to get an actual piece of detail that we can use to finalize the case. And then evaluation. This is going to be kind of the follow-up steps to the stages of interviewing. This is going to be what do we need to do in response to what we know already. We have to evaluate the context and what information we've gleaned from that and what details we've gleaned. So really, really important to note that. Okay, so as we move forward, we talk about this. This is going to be a subjective one. This is just, it was included in the section of the ACFE, and I didn't really have a good place to put it. But what is a covert operation, and how might covert operations be employed in a forensic investigation? So Brett, you've got the first really challenging question of the day. This is not a list. You just have me a definition and discussed what's going to be used.
Covert operation that is conducted undercover to conceal participators' identity.
Right. So the ACFE says that designed to obtain evidence by use of agents whose true intentions are not communicated to the target. So effectively the same idea. So how can these be used in forensic investigations? Generally speaking, when we talk about covert operations, this is going to be used as a point of surveillance. All right. And you should be familiar with this term already because the case actually alludes to surveillance. There may be points and times that you want to observe something without other people knowing. So you can conduct surveillance on people's activities and understand what it is they're doing at a point in time on a certain day of the week at a certain time of day. Surveillance does not need to be one of those things that's in those spy films. It's not necessarily becoming an undercover operative. It can be something as simple as sitting in a car and watching to see if other cars enter a parking lot. That's all there may be to it in a certain situation. And we like to make a big deal of it in those TV shows and those movies that it's really skies. Like they've got this van that the FBI operates, and the van actually has a label on the side saying that there's some sort of organization like a plumber or something like that. So nobody suspects that the white van is actually the FBI. And does that happen in the real world? Yes, but a lot less than you might think. Okay. It's not necessarily something that happens all the time. Oftentimes, it's just somebody, an individual that's involved with a forensic investigation, sitting in a car and just watching to see what happens. They don't even have not binoculars. You could bring binoculars, but you'd look really weird. Okay. You look really weird. My few times doing surveillance, I did not bring binoculars. That's all I can tell you guys. All right, here comes an interesting list. According to the ACCT Fraud Examiner's Manual, we have items that are listed as a facilitator and inhibitor of communication. So I had you guys go through this and list them out, and then I had you check your answers against the ACCT Fraud Examiner's Manual. So let's go ahead and go through these and see if we can identify what these are. So I'm going to go with the actual answers, and we're just going to go ahead and blurt these out as a group. I'm not going to kind of single out. So altruistic appeals. So first of all, altruistic appeals, does everybody understand the term altruism? You've heard the term altruism before? It's the idea that you're responsible for something bigger than yourself. All right. So you're responsible for the good or the well-being of the people at the organization, even if it might mean that you have to sacrifice something. What do we think? Facilitator or inhibitor? It's a facilitator. According to the ACFE Fraud Examiner's Manual, facilitator. This one I think is pretty obvious. Okay. If we try to make people answer to a higher calling, to something better, bigger themselves, and they're going to say, all right, I have a responsibility for my job to do this. All right. And that's going to be the goal there. What about catharsis? Catharsis, what does that mean? So if I say something is cathartic, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It means that I felt bad about something and now I feel better about it. Okay. So catharsis is basically kind of closure, is the idea of that. So catharsis. So what is that going to be, facilitator or inhibitor? That's also a facilitator. All right. So some big words there. And what's the rule whenever you see a big word and you don't necessarily know the definition? What's my guideline in every single course that I've ever had you all in? Go on Google and look it up. If you don't know what catharsis is, make sure you know the definition of catharsis. Okay. That's how you expand your vocabulary. That's just good life advice, guys, not even just forensics advice. All right. Chronological confusion. So basically people don't know when something occurred. Is that a facilitator or inhibitor? It's inhibitor. That's a pretty straightforward one. Competing demands for time. Okay, so people have got things they have to do, and they aren't necessarily be able to prioritize, which is a big problem for college students, especially students at Truman. All right, so is that inhibitor or a facilitator of your responsibilities here at Truman? Inhibitor. It's also inhibitor with communication. Okay. Ego threat. Okay, so you might think that if you answer the question correctly, that people might think of you as less than what you actually are. So is that a facilitator or inhibitor? That's an inhibitor as well. Okay. Very, very little has been had by saying, you're a terrible person. Give me an answer. Okay. You don't want to make people feel terrible. Etiquette. This is an interesting one. So etiquette, we already know what that is, about the standards of behavior that you should have in a particular area. Is this an inhibitor or a facilitator? This is an inhibitor. Okay. It's an inhibitor. How many people thought it was facilitator initially? Yeah, it looks like it's one. This is one of the ones I've got marked as saying this looks like it'd be a facilitator, but it's actually an inhibitor. Because people may not want to respond with the truth if they think that they may be they're not supposed to do it in a proper situation or a proper setting. It's like when you were younger, did you ever get called a tattletale? That's still a thing for kids, okay, when you're really young. That's an implicit form of etiquette for really, really young kids. It's like, okay, you don't tell when somebody does something wrong because then you're a tattler. It's kind of one of those weird things. Extrinsic reward. So if you do something, then you're going to get some sort of benefit externally, not necessarily internally. What is that going to be? A facilitator or inhibitor? Facilitator. Okay. Yeah. People think that they're going to be benefit from something, then they're going to facilitate. It's going to facilitate communication. Forgetfulness. Does everybody know what forgetfulness is? Hopefully so. All right. A facilitator, inhibitor. That's an inhibitor. Okay. Fulfilling expectations. Okay. Fulfilling expectations. So people think that this is what their responsibility is, what they have to do. Is that going to be a facilitator or inhibitor? Facilitator. This is a possible one that we could have looked at and said this is possibly an inhibitor of communication, but this is more of a facilitator, I think, in this regard. Inferential confusion. So something is very necessarily subjective, and so we have to infer what's meant by it, but people don't necessarily always take subjective information in the same way. So there could be some confusion as to what that means. Pretty obvious on this one, facilitator or inhibitor? Inhibitor, yes, an inhibitor. Need for meaning, okay, need for meaning. So what does it mean in this context? What are we talking about need for meaning? And the idea is that people are trying to provide clarity on their own insights. They're trying to get their own understanding of what's happening. Now, if you have somebody else that you're interviewing that's also trying to get clarification, is that going to facilitate the conversation or inhibit it? It's a facilitator, yeah. Did anybody answer that as an inhibitor initially? I definitely did. When I looked at need for meaning, I was like, oh, it's got to be an inhibitor. And then I said, oh, it's facilitator, because then I figured out what they meant by need for meaning. New experience. Okay. So people say people engage in a new experience and they're excited for the first time. If you have somebody who's basically not trying to hide anything and very open because they're really excited, is that an inhibitor or a facilitator? It's a facilitator. Okay. Facilitator. Recognition, people understanding what the context is of the questions that are being asked. Facilitator, inhibitor. Facilitator. Sympathetic understanding, people can relate to what the context of the questions are. The facilitator, inhibitor. Facilitator, yes. Trauma. So people basically might suffer consequences as a result of the interaction. So is that facilitator or inhibitor? Obviously inhibitor on that one. And then finally, unconscious behavior. People react in certain ways. Is this a facilitator or inhibitor? According to the ACFE, it's an inhibitor, but could it possibly be viewed as a facilitator? So if people react in certain ways and you can glean information from that, you could actually say, I got details that I wouldn't have otherwise got. I think there's an argument for both here, but the ACFE classifies this as an inhibitor, which makes certain sense in some regard. All right, so we talked about quick question 5. I keep scrolling down to the question or the names, guys. Sorry about that. ACFE identifies 5 types of questions can be asked in a forensic interview: introductory questions, informational questions, closing questions, assessment questions, and admission-seeking questions. So let's go ahead and call in my groups here. So Ben, can you tell me what the first 2 are? Introductory informational questions.
The first question will be framed like, can you tell me your understanding of why we are using prayer? And then what information you'll put in, can you walk me through your responsibilities and make time?
Very good, very good. That's almost identical to what I questioned. So you have to set the tone with the introductory question. So I am conducting interviews. Can you help me? So people are saying, oh, they need my help. This is something they need me for. I have a responsibility here. Again, that sets the tone for the question. It's not like we're attacking, saying you are assisting me. You are important. And then the informational questions where you gather details. How long have you worked here? How long? What's your responsibility? What's your role? There's examples there. So very good. All right. Next ones are going to be closing questions and assessment questions. Tyler M., what are those?
The closing question, we said it's like asking, is there anything else you think I should know or anything else you think I should speak to? And the assessment question, we said, who do you think would have the knowledge and access to bypass the security system for those specific missing things?
Good, good. Okay. So a little bit of detail in there. So something we talked about when we talked about closing questions is these are confirming understanding of details. Oftentimes when we talk about closing questions, we're talking about closed-ended questions. So an example of this would be, you suspect that Dr. Barnes is the one embezzling from the university. Is that correct? All right. So yes, no question. We get our understanding in that situation. Then the assessment questions, they establish credibility in certain contexts. Okay. So this is really, really important because it sets the stage for what the future is going to look like with respect to the interrogation. So establishing credibility, what would concern you most if you did something wrong and were discovered? Now, why is that an important question, establish credibility? Because if somebody is being honest and they did not commit the act, they're going to answer that question honestly. They're going to say, well, if I was caught, I'd probably lose my job and maybe face jail time, and I really don't want that. All right. So that's something that some people are generally not elusive with a question like that. But if you're attacking somebody who actually committed the fraud, it says, how dare you say something like that? I didn't commit this fraud. It's a defensive angle. Now, is that always going to be 100% of the time? No. But this is trying to determine a frame that everybody is approaching from. And you need to understand, once you've established that frame, you can move forward from the direction that's appropriate. The most important one is going to be this admission-seeking question. McKenna, what is this?
Just give examples like, why was this fraud committed or why did this happen?
Yeah, so admission-seeking questions, these are directing specifically towards a confession. So somebody you believe has actually committed the act, and then we want them to confess that. Now, oftentimes, the initial admission-seeking questions are closed-ended in nature. So an example of this, we believe that you've been helping Dr. Barnes steal from the school. That's what happened here, isn't it? So you don't give people open-ended question because they might divert it into a different pathway. Can you ask open-ended questions later on once you've achieved a confession? Yes, okay, because you get details. But you try to hammer home in one direction and one direction only, and then open it up to additional information that's provided. Admission-seeking questions are generally providing one direction. It's trying to say, we are getting to a certain point. We're going to continue on to this point. This is what happened. This is correct, right? And again, it's very, very directional and important in that regard. All right, consider the 5 types of interview questions identified in question number 6. How well do these questions align with the stage of interrogation identified in question number 2? So I had you go back to the original question from this particular document and say, how do these align up here? So when we talk about how we establish things, and then we get to note, obviously there's going to be some additional detail, like with being prepared and don't go out alone, don't necessarily relate to the questions or the types of questions being answered. But overall, when you look at this, do the types of questions align pretty well with the stages of the interview? I would say a very, very strong point. Now, there are some caveats to that, okay? So there may be some questions that are specific to a given stage, such as informational questions. They can be asked at all stages because you're just trying to gain details about a particular concept. Whereas introductory questions, they'd be largely restricted to engagement, okay? To the engagement questions at the beginning, okay? So establishing a baseline and trying to make the determinations there. So yeah, I think that these questions do a really nice job of framing what your responsibilities are as a forensic investigator. Now, does that mean you only need to understand one concept or another? No, you still need to understand both sets of concepts, but you do have a framework to operate from by using these questions, and knowing when these questions can be used will be really, really important for effectively interrogating individuals. All right, last question. According to the ACCT Fraud Examiner's Manual, 2 forms of covert operations are undercover operations and surveillance operations, okay? And these are the ones that are fun because you think about, hey, Dr. Barnes, did you ever go undercover? The answer is no, okay? No. Sometimes I dream about going undercover, but usually that's restricted to law enforcement, or maybe if you get really, really dramatic, somebody who's in a shadowy black ops organization that does stuff like that. But what's the difference between undercover operations and surveillance? And generally speaking, when we talk about undercover operations, they generally use deceptions and disguise. This is actual definition from the ASFE to gather information directly from a suspect. Now, disguise is not necessarily saying you're going to put on a fake nose and you're going to have a wig or something like that. I mean, you could, okay? That's not what they mean by disguise. It means you're trying to disguise your true identity. You are playing somebody else. You are playing the role of somebody else. So this would be like saying, oh, this is Dr. Barnes, our new tax professor. All right. So yeah. And then they say, no, this guy is not believable in that role. And that would be fair. That would be fair. Okay. I'd probably have to put on a wig if I did that. So yeah. I'm going off the rails. Sorry, guys. Now, surveillance, on the other hand, uses observation to gather information about potential misconduct of a suspect. And so surveillance is a lot more basic and straightforward, okay? It's still a covert operation because you're not sharing the detail and information of what you're doing with suspects, but it is also not trying to disguise your nature. And oftentimes it's not even trying to disguise what you're doing. If you're sitting in a car and watching, it's like one of those TV shows where you see the FBI, like I said, a black car says, okay, that's the FBI down there. They're not even trying to hide the fact that they're doing surveillance. And so there's a misconnection there, by the way, because one situation I said they're in a white van with plumbing logos on it, another one they're just sitting in a black car. So which one's correct? And the answer is both, but more frequently it's going to be the latter, where they're just sitting in a car and there's people watching, and it's very obvious that that's what the conduct is. They don't know exactly what's being looked for, but they are promoting some sort of surveillance and trying to determine what's happening in a certain situation. Now, this doesn't come up very frequently. I think over the entire time that I worked as a forensic investigator, I did 2 surveillance, and one of those was a complete and total bust that I showed up and then we had to stop immediately. Okay. I won't get into details on that, but we'll say that surveillance is not something that happens very frequently, regardless of the TV shows that you like to watch. It says they're always doing surveillance. This looks like so much fun. No. Usually it's a lot more paperwork and a lot more document analysis and detail. So if you're looking to become a forensic investigator because you're really excited about surveillance, don't hold your breath. That's all I can tell you. All right. Like I said, please make sure you get your topics and your individual lists to the groups. If you're a grad student, please give me that survey by the end of the day. I will see you all on Thursday for WorldCom.